morning, friends. We are on chapter 32, Enrique on top, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Robert Berardinelli knew a good thing when he saw one. When the Nayarit Mexicans came to town, this was to him a good thing. A balding man in his 50s from a family that owned a funeral home in Santa Fe, Berardinelli was a heroin addict. He'd been addicted to the morphine molecule since back in 1969. He'd smuggled pot from Mexico in the 1970s and done some prison time. He'd been desperate to get off dope for years, tried methadone, but it didn't help. For most of his addiction, he'd purchased his dope from various Santa Fe street dealers. This was risky. His family had been active in public service in Santa Fe for most of the century. Berardinelli had served as judge, city councilman, postmaster, and county treasurer. For him to be hustling hits of heroin on the street from people that he didn't always know exposed him to arrest and his family to shame. But a lot changed back in the summer of 1997, he later told the detectives, when a group of heroin traffickers from the Mexican state of Nayarit showed up in Santa Fe, led by a guy who occasionally went by the name Enrique. Heroin had taken Enrique a long way from the Toad. On the plane out of the Yuma airport heading to New Mexico, and the day that he watched those migrants rounding up, Enrique knew this trip was his moment, the one he had waited for. He'd been through childhood poverty, sold dope as a kid in the San Fernando Valley for uncles who underpaid him, then sold for that boss in Phoenix. He was married and had a lot to prove. He knew the business and was confident in his abilities as a salesman and motivator of people. Now in 1997, he was heading off to start his own heroin cell. Before leaving home, he asked his parents for their blessing. "I don't know if I'll be returning," he told them. Watching La Migra roust those dusty immigrants from the Yuma airport put something of a closure on the last nagging qualms he had about selling chiva. He arrived in Albuquerque, intending to make it the site of his first heroin business, but early on he met an addict from Santa Fe who said construction workers in that town were heavily addicted. He paid the guy $5,000 for an introduction to some of the addicts. He found Santa Fe wide open, no gangs, no competition. There he set up the heroin cell that had been his goal for almost half his life by then. He brought in kids from his village. Right off, that felt good to be an employer, a benefactor. He taught them how to drive, how to package heroin in balloons. He taught them the streets. He paid them $600 a week, plus all expenses, including the coyote's fee to cross them into the United States. Soon his cell was selling balloons around Santa Fe. He returned to Nayarit. He employed almost 24 kids over the next 3 years from the poorest ranchos. They worked harder, didn't steal, and were grateful. Some wanted to work for a bit and then return home to party. Others, as he had, wanted their own business and would work for him, only as long as it took to gain experience and capital. Either way, he saw their serious moods as he sent them off to go drive for him in northern New Mexico. Some pretended to joke around, but he knew it was a bluff. He knew how much was riding on their trips: a truck, a piece of land, a girl, the threat of many years in prison. Jalisco boys were church mice in the United States. That ended as soon as they got home. They were young men and wanted to party. Enrique liked to think of himself as a guy who took care of his employees, because he had been there himself. He took them to El Cuero strip club in Vallarta, all expenses paid, or to beach resorts in Nayarit. No sugarcane farmer was ever going to get into one of those places. Meanwhile, he hired his mother a maid. He paid for his sister's quinceañera, the traditional Mexican coming-out birthday party for a 15-year-old girl. He paid for another to attend college. In a speech at her graduation party, she thanked her brother for all he had made possible. He took his family to fine restaurants in Tepic, where they nervously rubbed elbows with the city's middle classes. He would look around these restaurants and realize that Chiva had finally allowed him to cross that river that separated his rancho from the world. "At least I'm not going to die wanting to know what's on the other side," he told himself. Enrique bought the land where he and his father were born. He hired men to help his father in the field. Seeing his son with some cocaine one day, his father took Enrique aside. "Be careful with that stuff," he said. "Don't use it." He admitted he had been a drunk for too long. It was the first time he had spoken to Enrique as a father should to his son. "That's all fine," Enrique said, "but why didn't you speak to me like this before?" The father said nothing. "You have to change," he upbraided his father. "No more yelling." Rancho fathers didn't speak to their children, but instead resolved every problem with blows or orders. Heroin changed that in Enrique's house. Still, there were headaches, the kind every small businessman faces. Enrique was constantly having to set up apartments for his guys in Santa Fe, getting them new cellular phones and Nextels. When a cop stopped one of his drivers, that car was useless. Finding new workers wasn't hard. Many men knocked on his door back home asking for work. But making sure they were trustworthy, then getting them up north and trained, that was a chore and costly too. He lived in the rancho, but was always returning to Santa Fe to supervise, make changes, corral his workers, and get them straight. From Santa Fe, he soon discovered the huge heroin market in tiny Chimeo, 25 miles north. He was content to supply the clans with his black tar. The town that had endured decades of heroin addiction began to cave in. 2% of the population, 85 people, veteran addicts, many of them, who had lived years on weaker heroin, died of black tar heroin overdoses over the next 3 years. Enrique's network changed heroin in Santa Fe too. Now all Robert Berardinelli had to do was call a number. These New Mexicans had a delivery system just for heroin, like pizza. For years before they arrived, the dope was brown powder sold by junkies who would dilute it. Quality varied widely week to week. But the Nayarit guys didn't cut their heroin. They were always careful to deliver only balloons containing a standard weight of black tar heroin, which was uniformly potent. Most surprising, they didn't use their product. Every heroin dealer Berardinelli had known up to that point was a user, prone to cutting his dope. But these guys couldn't care less about using. They seemed interested only in making money. I always dreamed of that. I'm going to get clean and make some money doing this, Berardinelli said. Every junkie I knew had that plan and never did it. These guys were fulfilling every addict's dream. To Berardinelli and the street dope fiends, those Nayarit balloons became a brand every bit as dependable as a Coke can or a Holiday Inn sign. You always knew what you would find inside. One day the Mexicans asked if Berardinelli could find them a car. They would pay him in heroin to put it in his name. So Robert Berardinelli undertook another life, that of facilitator for a cell of Jalisco Nayarit heroin dealers. He charged them 3 grams to put the car in his name and another 2 grams to insure it. Then the jobs multiplied. They asked him to wire their money back to Mexico, and he did. He put their pagers and phones in his name and was paid in heroin. Occasionally he would get a call from police telling him that a car registered in his name was being used by Mexicans who were stopped for speeding. He'd retrieve the car, and the Mexicans would pay him in heroin. When they asked him to find an apartment for a driver, he charged them 1 gram to find the place, 2 grams to fill out the lease application, and 1.5 grams to put the utilities in his name. Meanwhile, drivers rotated through every 3 months. They'd be taught the routes, Berardinelli told me when I tracked him down 14 years later in Santa Fe. They'd come up and make money, and they'd be gone, and you'd never see them again. Some would be back 6 months later. They were just kids trying to make money. The American dream kind of deal. They said they were from Nayarit. They talked about how little money they'd make back home and how great it was that they could come and get away with this and help their families. Back home they were doing farm labor, any damn thing they could without a lot of education. At a car lot once, Berardinelli met Enrique, who appeared to be the boss. He wanted to trade a Nissan for a Cadillac. Berardinelli signed the purchase agreement, and Enrique gave him 5 grams of heroin. Berardinelli spoke a little Spanish. Over 9 months, Enrique visited him often, usually with a request to put a car or a cell phone in Berardinelli's name. He always came with free dope. Berardinelli remembered Enrique liked to play the rough guy at first, and usually came with an entourage of 3 or 4, but he lightened up when he discovered Berardinelli was an old smuggling hand. Berardinelli told them stories of crossing weeds southwest to El Paso in airplanes driven by former Korean War pilots. He offered them cokes, since apparently they didn't drink. He never saw them high. Because of the way this business model ran, it was so much more relaxed, he said. There wasn't that element of fear in it. The dope was never cut. You got what you paid for. For a dope fiend like me, it was really nice. I go from struggling every day to cop my drugs to having all the dope in the world, and all I have to do is put my name on a bunch of documents. They were giving me all this dope to do things I said I'd never do. Buy them automobiles, rent apartments. When you're strung out on that shit, you just don't think properly. Reason goes out the window. You compromise your moral compass. All I had to do was call them, and they'd give me whatever I wanted. My addiction got worse and worse, like it did for a lot of people in northern Mexico when they got there. Have a good day, friends.